welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on ESG Standards and Taxonomies, a progress report. My name is Sarah Underwood, I'm the editor at 18 Group, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Bodo Vinmala, Senior Vice President and Product Management at Technology, Panayota Balfusia, Head of Sustainable Business Strategy at Kiga, Navin Ronia, Co-Chair ESG Working Group and UK Steer Group, member at Premier. I don't think I got that quite right, but Navin will introduce himself in a moment. And Mark Davis, partner at Element 22. As I said, I'll ask our speakers to introduce themselves in a moment, but first, how best you can use the webinar. To the right of your video screen, you'll see a Slido panel. There's an area for poll questions, and we'll be running 3 audience poll questions today. So I'll let you know when they're coming up, and do please vote. It gives us a good idea of where you're with your ESG work. And there's also a panel for your questions. So please put your questions there for the speakers at any time you want, and we will answer them later on in the webinar. So please just keep putting them there, and we'll gather them up and find an opportunity to answer them. Okay then, enough of me, and let me introduce our speakers to introduce themselves. So Bodo, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Thank you, Sarah, for the kind words, and welcome everybody also from my side. So I'm Bodo. I am approaching almost 25 years now working in the industry, helping our customers with the challenges of regulatory reporting, supervisory reporting, statistical reporting, financial reporting, resolution, and in the last years moving more and more into the topic as well of ESG. And I'm very happy to be here today and contribute to the discussion.
Very good, thank you very much indeed. And Panayota.
Hi, thanks everybody, and hello everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation, and my panelists, co-panelists. My name is Panayota Balfusia. I'm Head Sustainable Business Strategy at investment management firm Kiga, based in Zurich. And yeah, I'm really happy to be part of the panel and this discussion. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Over to you, Navin.
Hi there, call me Naveen, call me Nav, whatever you're comfortable with, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. So Nav Ronia, I've got over 16, 17 years of banking experience, worked in a number of tier 1 and tier 2 banks across pricing, risk and trading, now basically wearing several different hats, working for Premier as well, which is our professional risk managers international association, steering the whole ESG topic, which is very, very complex for risk managers and traders in this world as well. Sit on a number of other working groups as well, including GFANs, as well as having my day job basically at TCS, part of the Tata Group, advising different companies on sustainability strategies.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah. Mark Davis, as you mentioned, I'm a partner with Element 22, and Element 22 is a data and analytics advisory firm. We work primarily with financial institutions. I run the London office for Element 22, which we set up 4 years ago, and we help financial institutions really to mature their data and analytics capabilities, which won't surprise people on this call to understand, in the last couple of years has really focused heavily on the ESG space. So we've done a lot of work with both buy-side and sell-side firms to help them with maturing the practices around ESG data collection, normalization, standardization, and getting ready for things like SFDR reporting. We also, through that process, have developed a software solution to help firms to pull together some of their ESG data ingestion and to do some of their regulatory external reporting as well. And that's ESGI. And I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, that's great. So plenty of experiences in the room. So let's get started and start indeed with a poll question. So our poll question for the audience is, how does your organization see the state of play on ESG standards and taxonomies? And while you place your vote on that one, let me come to Mark and ask him how he sees the state of play on ESG standards and taxonomies.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think the way I'd best describe it is evolving, but evolving fast. I think if we roll the clock back a couple of years to think about ESG standards and taxonomies, it was largely a voluntary space. Firms were largely opting in. They were choosing to do various different types of disclosure, using different disclosure standards, which really the financial industry was consolidating around a number of different standards and helping to involve those. In parallel with that, what we're now seeing is the emergence of the mandatory reporting requirements, and that's started to come through in the last couple of years. And I think there's a real parallel here with what we saw after the Pittsburgh summit in 2009 with derivative reporting rules as a result of the financial crisis. There was a meeting of minds, a meeting of governments. It was a G20 mandate. And as a result of the agreements at that summit, we then saw lots of different independent regulators going off and evolving their own reporting requirements. And regulation then came like a sea with EMIR and Dodd-Frank reporting over a number of different years. Very similar here. We're seeing the Paris Climate Agreement really is the genesis. International governments and regulators realizing that work needs to be done. And then we're now starting to see the outputs of that, whether that's EU taxonomy, SFDR, and other regulations that are happening with the SEC, work with UK, work in Asia as well. So we're seeing the tidal wave of mandatory reporting, and I'd say we're probably at the start of it. You know, there's an awful lot that's still in draft form that's still being agreed at governmental level. There's an awful lot of consensus that has to happen in order to get these things over the line. So we will see more and more mandatory reporting in different jurisdictions, but we're seeing the first 2, 3, 4 coming through already and coming live. This is an important month as an example for SFDR reporting. One other thing just to add to that is we're also seeing consolidation around International Sustainability Standards Board and the work that's happening with financial reporting or mirroring the process around financial reporting. So the IFRS S1 and S2 standards have gone through an incredibly fast process, and that now is starting to, we're at the point where these reporting requirements will go live from January next year. And that's probably one that, if people aren't aware of it, that's one that firms on this call should really understand closely what's happening with IFRS S1 and S2 as reporting requirements. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. Bodo, what would you add there?
I think I agree that we are in a maturing phase, and that we see a lot happening on a national level. I'd like to point out what's happening on a supranational level, and I'd like to also point out the differences between standards and taxonomies, because I believe on the standard side we are much more mature, and we can see some sort of convergence on a global level towards widely accepted, adopted standards, which serve actually as references for all these national different implementation Mark was referring to. And Mark already mentioned the work of the IFRS, the ISSB, but I'd also mention the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative here, which is a de facto standard. And then very importantly, looking at the risk side, the task force for climate-related financial disclosures under Financial Stability Board. I think that's a very important aspect for the risk managers as well here, and the Global Carbon Disclosure Project. And all of them, I think it's really nice to see are working together, and they're aligning and they're starting to share. There are still differences between these standards, but we can see an emergence here. On the taxonomy side, I say we are way behind. We don't see emergence of global taxonomies. We see, I think, 20 plus national initiatives to build taxonomies. We can group them roughly into categories, the principle-based and the rules-based. So EU is following the rules-based approach. Taxonomies in ASEAN, Malaysia are more principle-based. Both of them have their advantages and disadvantages, but it's probably, we need to have much more experience in the implementation process to understand how well they're working, and we'll see probably much more changes in this area.
Okay, that's lovely. I think at the last count there were perhaps closer to 40 taxonomies around the world. Would anybody agree with that? Or am I picking numbers out of the air?
I've seen a very nice website that I'm happy to refer to later that says that there are about 300 standards, reporting standards. And if we're talking about initiatives, it's upwards of 2,000. So huge number of initiatives, quite a lot of standards, a smaller number of taxonomies, but there is a wide scope out there.
Okay, excellent. Okay, let's see those poll results, if we may see how people are thinking about this. And Bodo, would you like to comment on that? I don't think that's an unusual or unlikely answer.
There are too many. I think we just heard it, and the numbers are hard to capture. I think difficult to select and use probably is worthwhile exploring a little bit further, because I think that we can see methods of dealing with that, and it's, I think, going to be part of the discussion later. Difficulty to integrate, also going into that direction. Definitely, I agree, further development, at least on the taxonomy side. So that's my first take on this one.
Lovely, thanks very much indeed. And bringing Navin, if we may, how are different jurisdictions progressing and using standards and taxonomies, and what does this mean for financial institutions?
So look, jurisdictions are progressing well, may I say, but are jurisdictions working together? That's the elephant in the room at the moment, right? And we are already seeing salient differences between what we see from the SECC's proposal, the SEC climate proposal, obviously from EFRAG and the ESRS for Europe. We then also have a proposal from the United Kingdom as well on ESG standards as well. And when you start looking at, say, scope 3 carbon emissions, you'll see differences in the way the scope is of counting scope 3 carbon emissions, and you will see differences in what's included and what's not included. Now, what does that mean for a financial institution? For a financial institution, absolute nightmare, because essentially what we are saying is that, okay, we're taking out one scope from another company, we're adding carbon emissions for economic activity for another country, and you can't basically compare apples to apples. You're then effectively comparing apples to pears, right? Now, let's go back in history, and history teaches us post 2008. Mark talks about derivatives. Let's talk about capital rules. We had varying different styles of capital rules across the world as well, and we had Basel, who came in and tried to, and done a good job so far, but tried to bring it all together to have universal standards. And Sarah, that is what we need going forward. We need unifying authority at the top level, but we're making progress, and that's a good thing, right? And EFRAG, as part of submission, and ESRS are speaking to the SEC, and then they're all speaking to the ISSB as well. GRI looking to cross map their metrics as well, but more can be done.
Thank you. Mark, what would you say there in terms of how things are going and what it means?
Well, just thinking in terms of what it means for financial institutions, Nav's called out some really important different taxonomies and standards that are developing, and all of which are going to have an impact in different jurisdictions. And of course, it isn't just in the jurisdiction that those financial institutions are based. If you're marketing your products in other jurisdictions, you need to also be able to comply and report in those jurisdictions also. So the overreach is international. The number of companies that you need to gather information on is also international. And if you think about some of the risk aspects of thinking about your exposures to your trading counterparties, if you're a bank, you need to understand aspects of where they're physically located. What are the climate risks associated with the location? What are the sea levels? What are the temperature aspects? So suddenly, lots of additional data that you need to be able to gather against your counterparts, information that you've never had to gather before, but really critical information that you need to start to bring into your organization and extrapolate out into future, start to think about not just the backward-looking data, but also forward-looking targets and how that will impact your own risks as well. And that's just for the risk side. If you're a buy-side organization, you need to gather data from all of your portfolio companies. It won't just be climate. For SFDR, you need to understand diversity, pay ratios between best paid and lowest paid employee. And you need to gather this information broadly across all of your portfolio companies and then actively maintain that. So the data gathering exercise alone is enormous. Not all of that information exists today. there's a lot of gaps. And I think the reality is the regulators understand that there are gaps and that firms are expected to report today based on what they can reasonably gather. But over time, those gaps won't be as accepted as they are at the outset. So firms have to think about how they're going to, over time, start to close some of those gaps, move away from de facto standards and using approximations and move towards getting the real facts. And some of the reporting standards will help with that. But for small startups, scale-ups, private markets rather than public companies, it's going to be a long time before there are rules in place that mandate their reporting. We'll see the rules come in for the large listed companies in major jurisdictions. That's expected. That they're already existing today. They'll continue to evolve, but that doesn't cover every counterparty in every trading book or every portfolio. So there will absolutely be gaps, and firms have to accept that, but also start to think about how they'll close them.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. And bringing in Paniota, what are the sticking points and challenges of ESG data and standards particularly?
Yes, certainly. And I think Mark mentioned a few. It's good to mention that, and it's been discussed. So there's a lot of evolution, ESG standards, taxonomies. This, especially where it's regulatory driven, is building up a huge momentum to improve availability, relevance of ESG data and frameworks. How do we understand those? But yes, there are many challenges that remain. ESG data have continued to have limitations in terms of quantity, quality, consistency, timeliness, how you get access to them, how you use them. Interpretations diverge. What's sustainable activity, what is not. They remain really divergent. And there are quite a few reasons behind this. So it was mentioned that there's not mandatory disclosures everywhere, but that's increasingly the case. Even where there are mandatory disclosures, the coverage is partial. So a subset of companies actually are mandated to report, and typically there are various phasing periods. So it's going to come. It's going to come in the next year. It's going to be gradual, and it's not going to be complete. Private market were mentioned, smaller companies are mentioned for some good reasons, by the way, right? And there is variation across reporting standards, and I think we'll probably talk about this later as well. And the variation can be in terms of scope. Is the information provided on climate, or is it also broader? That varies. What's the emphasis? Is it on financially material information, or also on impact materiality? And so, but even a specific, let's say, regulator themselves, they're really evolving their standards. So where there are standards, those are themselves evolving. And take the example of ISSB, where all looking forward to, was mentioned, really important announcements coming up with the publication of the first 2 standards of ISSB. But they also, in the UN Convention for Biodiversity, COP15 in December 2022, they announced that they are going to build new standards taking into account of water, biodiversity and ecosystems. So they're evolving. And then talking about just referring back to sticky points and difficulties, assurance. There is information out there. It's going to be increasingly more guided from regulators, but is there assurance? Currently not, but that's increasingly the case. It's coming in. It's coming in from the EU. It's coming in from the Security Exchange Commission. That means basically external audit. So that's changing. And then the delivery mode and format. Currently, it's pretty much, the sustainability report of one firm is widely different than the other firm. Where you're looking for that information is so difficult. But here too, it's with kind of machine readable outputs being mandated, hopefully increasingly. That's also going to change. And wanting to also mention taxonomies as a separate but related topic, we have also some of the same sticking points there. There are multiple taxonomies with various nuances across them, different stages of development. Not every jurisdiction, of course, has endorsed the taxonomy. Even where one is in place, the scope can be more or less limited with respect to the sustainability topics and challenges that are covered, or also with respect to the economic activities. And currently, for example, we have seen very, 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 very happy to see from the EU, the EU taxonomy coming out with now the regulated technical standards across all 6 of their goals. So there's progress.
Okay, we'll come back to.
Yeah, I was just going to add one more point as well. Let's not forget the audience who are based in the UK. We're all a bit lonely now because of Brexit, right? So there's also a lot of confusion between what the UK are doing and what Europe are doing. So the UK enshrined NFRD, Non-Financial Reporting Directive, of the EU in 2014 into UK sovereign law. So we've got companies now looking at NFRD, then doing, oh, let's do a little bit of a CSRD or all of CSRD, for example, right? But at the same time, the regulator, the PRA and FCA, have been very clear that they support the ISSB as the metrics that should be used, right? So sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's always important to mention Brexit in these conversations.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. And coming to you, Bodo, we've just talked about how many and how complex this all is. How can firms manage these sort of multiple ESG data and reporting standards that are in the market? How do they use one, two? How do they manage it? How do they select?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think Nevin and Panyota also already pointed to the answer, because this is not unprecedented. We have seen confusion of standards, various degrees of adaptation at national level, and a lot of change in other areas: credit risk, liquidity risk, resolution, financial reporting. So we are kind of used to that and to that kind of regulatory confusion. And ESG is just, adding on to that. But basically what I suggest is to rethink about ESG in the context of what you have done already with other areas. So you likely have already a regulatory watch. You will probably incorporate ESG in your regulatory watch. You have processes in place how to deal with run and change. And also, we know on a very generic level how to deal with multiple standards. We need to understand which ones are applicable to us, which ones we want to do. Additionally, on a voluntary basis, we need to dig deep into them, and especially in the requirements, the measurements, and the data requirements. We need to understand commonalities and differences between the data requirements. And that's a lot of hard work, but we will talk about it later. There's also a lot of tooling already and help already available for that. And then you need to set up a reporting schedule and a reporting scheme. I think the biggest point and the biggest topic we will talk more about, and we started talking about, is getting the data and modeling the data and incorporating that data into your standard processes, which you have already.
Okay. And what would you add there in terms of how firms are actually managing these varied standards and all this ESG data?
Yeah, maybe I'll just take a step back and say there are perhaps two different approaches. One is a strict compliance approach, so where you see the risk and legal perspectives really dominating within a firm. The focus here is ensuring ESG data points required for disclosures are there. Risk controls, governance processes required for compliance are there. That's one approach. And there's also another approach where there is a view that ESG reporting standards taxonomies, there's a positive mindset around it. There's actually a huge source of information, multiple perspectives on sustainability topics, and how can that actually be leveraged usefully to inform and help develop proprietary views that can in turn be channeled into financial products with improved sustainability attributes. And in this approach, more teams, perhaps especially the investment teams in the front office, are engaged in maximizing the value of ESG data standards, taxonomies, in order to pursue the sustainability objectives, strategy, product, and communication as well with stakeholders.
Okay. Now we're going to come to you with our next question, and it asks about taxonomies. What are the challenges here? We've talked about that there are very many there behind standards. What are the problems here, and how can people cope with them?
I think that the taxonomy is a great idea. I think the issue is that when you go and speak to a corporate and you say to a corporate, do you understand the data that you are generating and the metrics you are generating? Do you know where that goes into when the financial side looks at your company? 75% of the time the answer is no, because the taxonomy is so stringent and very detailed. And don't get me wrong, it's a great idea, but there needs to be more education of the taxonomy to corporates. So you've got a bankers meeting going on, corporate comes in, banker comes in, well, show us your data sets. Oh, tick, no, tick, no. tick sheet. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, we're subject to EU taxonomy. I didn't know. Are we? And it's all about making a company investable. And an interesting one is the European Union were fighting about, is nuclear and gas a sustainable taxonomy sector? And because of obviously the unfortunate events that are happening in Ukraine and Russia and the energy crisis, nuclear and gas got the green tag on there, right? Even in the proposed sustainable framework for taxonomy for the UK, we are basically going to look at making certain sectors green, which are not green in the European Union. Now, that creates a lot of confusion. What you're effectively doing is you're saying, okay, channel capital into this country because they're green, but don't channel capital into that country because it's brown. So we're basically going to have capital going maybe in the wrong direction or systematic risk building up. And when we price as well, and we price credit, when Mark said there's a lot of challenges with data. If you have challenges with data and you don't understand the data quality score or how good the data is, right? How can we even go and price whether it's a traditional bond or a green loan, a sustainability linked loan? Again, conduct risk, potential of greenwashing. And going back to your question, Sarah, this is just differences in the taxonomies, issues with the taxonomies, right? And you can see what are the downstream issues that happen.
Okay, Mark, what would you add to that? I think that's pretty good. More bad news, really.
Well,
what would you add?
I think good and bad. If we think about the spirit of a taxonomy, this is about channeling private financial flows into investments that have sustainability benefits. So this is about ensuring that funding is going to companies that are doing the right thing for the planet, essentially. That's really the purpose behind the reasons that these taxonomies are being developed. And the taxonomies, therefore, typically will go sector by sector and look at the guidance for that specific sector on what good practices look like. If we all probably are most familiar with EU taxonomy because that's the most mature. It's the one that's been out there for the longest. And for those that want to understand it, there's actually a relatively easy to use, as good as I think you can get at the moment, tool available, which is called the EU Taxonomy Compass. Which, if you Google that and find the Taxonomy Compass, you'll be able to understand a little bit more about how EU taxonomy works sector by sector. There are some important things in there. It talks about do no significant harm. So as well as making sure that organizations do things that are positive, also making sure that there are no byproducts that are having a negative impact, such as wastewater or pollution or lack of recyclability in materials. So it's impressive in its depth. And I think the taxonomies are impressive in their depth on a sector by sector basis, thinking about how organizations need to comply. What are the sticking points and challenges? And actually, to say that is a positive thing, because we're really starting to get into the detail with these taxonomies. So it isn't all bad news. We are starting to understand these sectors well and have something. We've got a baseline now to challenge. So we should all celebrate the fact that the EU taxonomy standards are there. What I would say is that usability is still a challenge. It's a real challenge. So if you start to look into some of these standards, you start to get into a circular process of connecting to other documents, other regulations, all of which are referenced and embedded. I don't know how many 100,000 references there are to other annexes of EU regulation within the taxonomy, but it reminds me of an old Asterix cartoon, something that was called The House That Drives You Mad, where you would go to individual desks and be handed a new form to complete in order to go to the next desk and be handed another form. And it does feel a little bit that way when you start to look at EU taxonomy and start to look at all the different reference points that you need to be able to digest and understand for potentially hundreds of different regulations in order to be compliant. So there must be ways to increase simplicity, to make these things easier, whether that's through third-party tooling or whether that's ideally through the regulators starting to make it more usable, more digestible for end consumers. So that for me would be a big sticking point, and I think we saw that in the survey. The second highest point on the survey was usability. It related to, how do I use these things, because it is complex, and you don't necessarily want to have to employ a legal firm to understand every data point.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, sorry, I think I'm done.
Okay, let me come back to Bodo, and we've talked about these things kind of separately, and we talked about integration a little bit, and it was on the poll question, obviously. So how best can the financial firms manage the impact of ESG standards and taxonomies on existing data and processes? Obviously, there's a big integration question here, and how much data they're going to take in, how they're going to do that, how what's the impact?
Yes, and I think we started to touch upon that already. When you look at the data needs to do reporting according to these standards and with the taxonomies, you could broadly capture the data in two separate buckets. One is financial data, and then the other one is ESG specific add-ons. So the first thing to understand is that I think you want to start building upon the data you have already, the financial data you have already, which you're using for financial reporting and financial disclosure, because also regulators will compare your ESG disclosures with other reports they will be having. And you want to not have a ESG silo, which is not reconcilable with the financial data there. And the second thing, if you then look at the ESG specific data, Mark already alluded to it, there's going to be two different buckets of data you need to gather. I think one is around economic activities and how well they are aligned with taxonomies, and the other one is about your counterparties and how green your counterparties are. Now, the problem with this is that this data, as Mark has already said, is temporal, so it's changing over time. Yeah, so when you start out with a business with a counterparty, that might change over time and he might become more brown or green. When you start to finance an object, you have certain assumptions on how well this is aligned with taxonomy. Once the object is built in production, it could be very different. Also, I believe taxonomies will change. Also, to some extent, taxonomies do not cover every economic activity yet. So this is going to be a challenge, and you will probably, from a banking perspective, need to look at your whole loan process from origination to repayment. That's also coming to the point Navin is saying, what are you actually doing? And you will probably need more people in the business who understand taxonomies, not only in the reporting areas, but also in the loan department, especially when it comes to pricing and structuring. That's going to be a very critical going forward.
Okay, fine. Paniota, as a practitioner, how do you see this? How is it impacting existing systems, and how do you cope? You've got your mute on.
That's a good one. Thank you. Someone had to do it. So it really depends, talking about with financial firms more broadly, where they're based, where they do business, what type of products. And importantly, I think this is also important to mention, what sustainability related claims they make about the products. So the burden and the impact of ESG standards and taxonomies is not the same across the board from, let's say, a regulatory perspective, but also what the business is trying to do, who to approach. So the higher the bar a company places with regards to the sustainability that its products, it as a firm represents and tries to achieve, of course, and I think quite naturally, the higher the onus. Yes, and just to refer to a point I made before, in terms of how to manage this, there can be a very risk compliance focused way. It's all about risk. It's all about meeting that compliance, which of course we have to do. And that's complex in itself. And we'll talk about this, I think, in a bit. For example, partnerships with service providers and so on. But on the other hand, it's trying to also look at the positive, because there's a lot of information out there that they didn't used to be, and that can be supportive actually in achieving some of the goals regarding sustainability of a firm.
Okay, fine. We touched on tools. Let's have a better look at them. So a bit of technologies, tools, solutions here. What's helpful? What would people be looking out for?
Yeah, and I'd like to start with the tools that we are offering at Regnology, if that's okay. There are tools out there, specialized reporting software, which we are providing, which actually help our customers, with understanding data needs and helping them also with the data modeling side. Then helping them with the ingestion of data, analyzing the data for completeness, correctness, then helping them with calculations in certain areas. You need to do portfolio calculations like your green asset ratios and stuff. Tools are helping with that. And then, of course, you have various reports you have to fill and to send in various formats to various stakeholders. And so there are tools out there who can help you with that. Then there are tools out there which can help with a whole regulatory watch topic, so understanding better what's out there in regulations, what's changing and how that is impacting you. And of course, I'd like to say that there's also specialized consulting services, because you need to have a very deep level of expertise on these ESG topics. And I think that many companies out there are still struggling to build that internally. So there are consulting services who can help you with that.
Okay, thanks. Paniata, what would you add there? What sort of tools are you looking at?
One, that these service providers on data, technology, and on a consultancy basis have so many more of them, and I think that's great, because it will be needed in some part of the journey, in some section. One thing I would like to add is that for a financial firm, it's likely the case that they will need to partner with a few service providers. That becomes complex. Something we observe, and Bodo mentioned that they're doing it as well, and I think that's great, is that there's some financial data service providers out there that do some of the work internally, so they're aggregators, and they use one technology solution, one platform solution, and this really helps. Some other financial firms may build internally the custom technological platforms in order to streamline on the data front, for example. That can be very good because it's fit for purpose, but of course it has high costs, and also from a resource perspective. The other thing I think it's important to point is that there is a burden of due diligence, right? So as you're partnering and working with different service providers, it is important to do very good due diligence on them, and that requires time, requires focus on the use case on every. Last point is that these service providers, many service providers, there's not a specific regulatory requirements apart from ESG ratings, which just this week we saw with the package of the European Commission new proposals for rules about ESG ratings providers coming into a regulatory context with rules around transparency, reliability, how to manage conflicts of interest, and coming into a supervision. UK is undergoing a similar consultation, so that's also positive.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed. Let's take a break for some audience questions, and I have quite a number here, so let's see what we can do. And Mark, coming to you with this one first. It's a very broad question. It's not really necessarily about standards and taxonomies, but here we go. Let's see if we can do it. It says, how does the panel see generative AI helping financial firms with ESG?
Good question. So I think there's obviously a lot of buzz about generative AI at the moment, and there has been now for 3 or 4 months. And there's a lot of excitement about the capabilities of the solutions. And I think, we will go through the traditional hype curve as we do with all technologies, where there's an awful lot of hype followed by a lot of frustration around the potential of the solutions, and then over time we'll start to see the real progress in that space. What we know from discussions in the industry so far is that the first reaction of lots of financial institutions was to say, stop, we don't want to use this until we understand it more. And many organizations actually, the first step was to put a block on using those kind of tools internally for any report writing, decision making, and information gathering, because of lack of understanding of what the perceived risks might be. But actually, we've relatively quickly come through that, and we've seen particularly in the buy-side industry, that firms can see a competitive advantage in using those kind of tools. Now, can it be used to gather high quality information on sustainability matters? I think where data exists in the public domain, then of course that's something that these tools will be able to benefit from. The reality is that there are still gaps within information in the public domain. So what you need to avoid, of course, is estimates and guesswork and filling in facts with guesswork. And I think, you know, at this stage, no one's going to have the confidence that that's the case. So long-term potential, let's see how it goes. Short-term, I don't think so.
Okay. Do you want to say something now? You look like you really do.
I'm grinning away there, you know. I fully acknowledge Mark's comments, right? But look, we're talking about data, and we're talking about what we used to call non-financial data, right? You know, these were departments that were kind of buried away in the basement, and you know, only came out of fruition after the pandemic, right, or during the pandemic, because we saw ESG how important it was. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone who was buried in the basement, right? You know, but the issue is the data, right? Now, these are climate models we're talking about. We're talking about modeling D&I, gender pay, gender equality, industrial rate of accidents, health and safety, right? Governance, regulatory penalties, right? I think AI does play a big part. And if we can subject data to AI to say that, given what you can basically find out there, build a data set, use proxying, do bridge gapping, use interpolation, extrapolation, etc., etc. But disclose, how did you use the data logic, and what was the quality of the data, and what was the source and the waterfall methodology, let's say, and disclose it in your metrics. Because one of the number one problems with ESG is that it's not forward-looking. Investors want to see forward-looking ESG metrics, especially a financial institution, making a loan on, let's say, a 7, 10, 15-year basis, right? One of the issues that we see in financial institutions is, even up to C-suite level, our time horizon is 5 to 7 years. So let's try and use AI and a bit of human intervention, right? I'm not saying the Terminator should come in and basically build the whole carbon emission reporting data out to 2050 for every single corporate company listed on the FTSE 100, you know. But we need data sets, and let's use AI, let's use ML, right? You know, but let's disclose it. Data quality scoring, where was the source, you know, and then instead of saying that, hey, look, these are actually my carbon emissions, right? And then you have a look at them and you're like, actually, is that company really going to hit a reduction in scope 1 and scope 2? Are they really going to hit scope 3? Are they really going to go to carbon neutrality in 2030? You know, this is a new area, you know.
Okay, fine. So that's going to be something that we'll carry on debating with how we're going to do that, where AI will fit in. Panyota, one for you, again, as a practitioner. It says, or it asks, everyone's talking about ESG, but how do we embed it and the data standards and taxonomies we are using across the bank? Sounds like people aren't playing fair, perhaps, or that people have very different opinions.
So, I mean, if I understand the question, it depends on where you do. If you're a bank, financial institution with many locations, possibly selling in locations where you need to look at all of that. So you need to look what is the regulatory setup, and it could well be the case that you have to face multiple standards, multiple taxonomies. So there is no going around to that. The good news is, you know, partially around alignment and how we're progressing towards there. And I think that's the next topic. So I think that the bad news is that there's a lot to do, and there's no going around the existing regulation. I think the good news is that there are steps towards alignment.
Okay.
May I add on to that, because I think it's a very important point, and I said it before. I think it's important to build on what's already there in financial reporting. I think that should be the base. And you want to add ESG data into your existing processes, financial process and reporting processes. I think that's the key to success in this space.
How do you then, Bodo, bring the people with you, the cultural aspect? You know, they're all very busy, they're all very keen on ESG. They're not listening to you when you're talking about particular standards and things. You've got to bring everybody with you.
Yeah,
is it a cultural issue like so many of these things?
It's going to be another big change. So you need to educate, and I alluded to that as well. It's not just a team sitting somewhere in the back office doing ESG, but you need to really bring the message of ESG across, especially the whole loan process and into the finance departments as well, because it's going to have an impact.
It's going to be everybody's biggest side of the desk job.
Yeah, and data scientists as well, right? You know, to help out and make sure that AI and ML is actually working correctly.
But we had this kind of waves. We had GDPR data. We had then know your customer. We had AML. So we had these waves, and it's similar to that in many ways. So I think banks should be used to these kind of changes.
Okay, thank you. And Bodo, one last question for you here. It says, we have selected data and reporting standards and a taxonomy. What is the likelihood we will need to change these, and how difficult would that be?
So I do believe that this is an evolving place, as we said in the very beginning. And now I cannot say which ones you have selected and changed, but you will definitely become obliged to fulfill certain requirements by your regulators. And that's going to be subject to change. So that's all I can say without understanding which ones have been selected. But definitely, this is not going to be a implemented once and let it run thing. This is definitely something which is constantly needed to be updated.
So firms need to be very aware that change will come. They will have to make it, and they need to be ahead of the game if they can be.
I mean, that's what regulators as well saying. We are learning. We are implementing this for the first time. So we're rolling out this taxonomies. We will be learning. We will be seeing. We will be adjusting. We will maybe say that nuclear energy is green or not green, or we will change all of that. So I think nobody is assuming that this is a static thing at this point.
Okay, fine. I just wanted to share with our audience a useful piece of information. If you want to find a link to the EU taxonomy guidance, you'll find it at eceuropa.eu, sustainable-finance-taxonomy. You can remember all of that, but you will be able to find it at EC Europa. Okay, lovely. Let's go back and thank you to our audience for your questions and to our speakers for their answers. Let's run another audience poll here before coming back to my questions. It is, to what extent does your organization expect ESG data standards and taxonomies to be aligned on a global basis? We've touched this quite a lot, but we'd like to hear your view. So while you vote, let me come to Paniota to look forward and tell us what extent she would see things being aligned on a global basis.
Okay, perhaps what this would mean to firms as well, because we had some questions around that. I think it's important to just say it will mean more work in the short term, as firms, financial firms, are adapting their data collection, their management processes, their risk and governance controls. That will be more work. However, in the longer term, it really should be a net benefit, as consistency, comparability, and understandability really elevate. So going first to the question again, how is alignment? Where are we with that? I think an important, perhaps a cornerstone topic that's becoming increasingly emphasized across regulators is accounting principles. We see more emphasis on relevance, faithful representation, exactly as we have seen with financial data before in financial reports. And it's increasingly being complemented by a requirement for external audits in the ESRS, European Sustainability Reporting Standards in the EU, and also the proposed SEC rules in the US around climate, in particularly prescribed limited assurance, meaning no obvious inconsistencies, and are in the future may also require reasonable assurance, which means positive efforts to ensure that the information is correct. EOSCO has proposed a global assurance framework, so we're moving towards that accounting level of robustness, which is great. If we look from a content perspective, alignment of standards is taking shape initially with regard to information that's relevant for enterprise value creation, financially material information, including, for example, general governance and risk management reporting, but also reporting around climate, where TCFD is a common reference. It was mentioned a few times, the ISSB standards, when they're officially public, the end of this month, they're likely to become a baseline. The UK has already indicated it will look at and potentially look to endorse those standards. The Security Exchange Commission has also indicated it may look again and make adjustments to its proposed rules around climate to make them more aligned. And importantly, and I'm not sure if that's enough out there, that message, the IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commission, will also review those standards and potentially endorse them. And this could pave the way for broad adoption of the standards from within its 130 or so members. The EU itself, it has recently, last week, published its first set of draft ESRS, Environmental Sustainability Reporting Standards. And according to the European Commission announcement, those standards have incorporated intensive and constructive technical discussions with both the ISSB and the GRI to ensure the highest degree of interoperability that they could manage. So we see that there is a lot of different standards and regulators at play where there is more commonality, meaning around general reporting requirements and climate in particular, there is more interoperability and more alignment. And let's note, moving a little bit to the topic of taxonomy is also very important, that leverage those information to try and bring them into a context of sustainability goals. This is in the end what it's all about. And here, climate change is, let's say, the little bit of the common denominator across the taxonomies out there. Some taxonomies, like the EU taxonomies, go much further. Pollution, circular economy, water and marine ecosystems, biodiversity and ecosystems. The EU taxonomy as a first mover has set out some certain concepts like substantial contributions and do not significant harm and minimum governance criteria. We see those repeated in the other taxonomies. However, the underlying metrics and performance indicators can vary. There is other areas of difference. For example, the EU taxonomy we have identifies green and transition activities. Other taxonomies have a traffic light system, such, for example, the Indonesian taxonomy. And differences are also with respect to trying to acknowledge, and actually taxonomies want to address regional needs and specificities for very good roles. And here, just to close on this, there are regional initiatives to develop regional taxonomies, notably in Asia and Central America. This could provide a further wave of alignment in the future, or a wave of alignment in the future.
Okay. Nevin, what do you think? Are we going to get there, or is it always going to be slightly wonky?
Look, we're definitely getting there. I mean, I think to add, one thing we haven't talked about is there's the TCFD out there, right? There's a TNFD, which is in beta at the moment, in draft, right? So TCFD being your climate-related risks, and then you've got your nature-related risks in the TNFD as well. And what's very, very interesting is that what's being asked for in the EU taxonomy is very, very similar to what you got in your TCFD and TNFD disclosure. And then also, if you're a UK-based company as well, you know, you will be doing SECR reporting as well, which is sustainability, environmental emissions, carbon reporting as well. So again, data is already there. Metrics are already there. We look at the GRI. The GRI historically been very APAC driven, very strong in governance and social metrics. The SASB, which is now incorporated under the ISSB, more investor driven, very US orientated as well. So we're going on that journey, and we're getting there. Once we've got there, then that's when we need the maybe Mark can build the Terminator building machine to look at all those metrics and how they look in the next 10 to 15 years. Yeah, we must talk about that over coffee one day, Mark.
Look forward to it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see the poll results. If we won't comment on these. I think it'll give us a very clear idea. Okay, I think a fair reflection of what we've been talking about. And let's run another quick poll, if we may. I'd like to run this one. It asks what are the benefits of getting ESG standards and taxonomies right at your organization. And please tick as many boxes as you feel appropriate. And let me come to Mark to talk about the benefits here.
Thanks, Sarah. So in terms of the benefits of getting this right, well, clearly, if you have a firm understanding in this space and clarity around how standards and taxonomies are applied, then investment decision making, which is one of the ultimately the key drivers, becomes a much easier process. You have clarity over which companies you want to support, and potentially you have a competitive advantage if you do this better than your competitors, because you can start to make effective decisions around investments. So I think investment decision making is clearly going to be important from a front office perspective. Obviously, eliminating greenwashing is in everybody's best interests. So starting to cut through the noise and really understand the credentials of individual organizations becomes much easier when the standards and taxonomies have been applied correctly. I think what we should also think about here is the reputational risk. I think that's a really important one. So large financial institutions, if they get this wrong, we've already seen investor action, we see bricks thrown through windows, we see mass demonstrations based on perception. And it's really important for firms to make sure that they stay on the right side of their investors and general broad sentiment around this. So that's both in terms of their investments, but also making sure that their own organization is leading the charge on that, not just the way that they invest in third-party firms. And I think, lastly, probably the last one to add is around reg reporting. If your reporting is clean and accurate, then you're not going to get fined. And again, there's reputational impacts if you get that wrong as well.
Okay, Odo, what would you add here?
Not much to add. I think you covered it, so I'm not going to repeat.
Okay, fine. Can we see those poll results? Again, we won't comment on them, but it'll be out of interest for everybody. Okay. Okay, interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Again, not far off what we were, I think, talking about there, what Mark was talking about at least. Lovely. Well, we're coming very much to the end of our time, and I'd like to come to our final question, ask all our speakers to share some advice for practitioners working with ESG standards and practitioners, working with ESG standards and taxonomies. They are the practitioners. So, Mark, please, will you kick off here?
Okay, very quickly, start now. This isn't going away. So understand it, get close to it, and if you're not doing work around standards and taxonomies and understanding what's there and what's required, start at the end of the process and work back. So what do you need to report externally, and then think about how you're going to bring that information in.
Okay.
I would also say consider what you're going to do in terms of storage, mastering, and sharing the information internally. And then lastly, I would say, think about guidance. So how do you consistently share this information with all of the internal stakeholders who need to be on the same page? How can you support training internally?
Okay, a few words from you, Paniota.
I've said this a few times now. I think it's important to also approach it with a positive mindset. So how can you draw on this information to drive your business in the direction you want, your clients want, communicate better, develop better products? That's B1. Then focus. Ideally, pick a sustainability topic, a sustainability practice where you feel the resources, data, passion of your team and organization are best suited, and focus primarily on that. And yeah, take advantage of a growing body of research in the academic sphere. There's a lot being done there, as well as professional networks, associations, share knowledge, leverage knowledge, potentially for partners as well.
Okay, Bodo, what would you say?
So as I said, build on what you have done in other areas, build on your financial data, build on your existing reporting processes, build on your existing regulatory watch, stay informed up the curve. Don't treat this as a silo. And I think the strongest focus has to be on proper data modeling and data governance here.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave it there. So thank you to Bodo, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing that expertise and experience. Thank you too to Regnology for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a few 18 group events that may be of interest to you. You can download our ESG Handbook 2023, which is a detailed guide to everything you need to know about ESG and how to manage the regulatory requirements. Alternatively, you can sign up to attend our 5th of October RegTech Summit in London, or you can join our 18th of July webinar on the evolution of enterprise data management for ESG, managing non-standard and unstructured data, which we only just touched on today. So hope you'll join one or many of those. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Paniota, Bodo, Mark, and Navin. And thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we are always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.
Thank you all.